All right. Hello and welcome to this latest podcast episode. Welcome to episode 2 with Lee. Previously in a teaser, we briefly discussed patient access to CAR T therapies. Lee, welcome to the show for the second time.
Thanks, Nick. Nice to be talking to you again.
So Lee, the first thing I would love to sort of dig in this conversation is about the sort of history of patient access in CAR T. So briefly in our sort of teaser, we discussed that we started off at highly specialized medical centers. I'd love it if you could give us a brief sort of overview of the history.
Yeah, absolutely. This is largely built on the back of two very different things, right? One is stem cell transplant, which is a practice of medicine. And the other is Dendreon's Provenge, right? So Dendreon's Provenge, Dendreon, it's a prostate cancer cell therapy. It's an activated dendritic cell, not engineered in the sense that we think of engineered T cells today. And the physicians that prescribe that are largely urologists in outpatient settings. So the clinical trials that Dendreon did largely involved urologists that largely practice in outpatient settings. They're not hematologists, oncologists. Their starting material relied on apheresis, but they didn't have any formal relationship with the apheresis unit. And so Dendreon took it upon themselves to build out, to contract and help build out an infrastructure of apheresis across the country, outpatient apheresis, that they could utilize for the apheresis starting material for manufacturing Provenge that they would manufacture centrally and then ship out to these clinics for injection.
Okay, so this was sort of the first infrastructure.
This was the first infrastructure built for a commercial cell therapy, right? It was the first, FDA approved cell therapy approved as a cell therapy. Way back in the day, there were some cell therapies approved as devices, if you could believe it. There wasn't regulations for these things. And so that paradigm gave us a number of things. First of all, it recognized that apheresis is the starting material for the manufacture of a drug. Mm-hmm. Dendreon managed that entirely. But Dendreon still pays today. It still pays, as they have always done, for the procurement of that starting material. They manage that and pay for it directly. It's also, of course, the safety profile for that was much different. They didn't have nearly the same kind of, cytokine storm and ICANS, that the CAR Ts do. So it was very comfortably delivered in outpatient facilities. And these patients, for the most part, were sick, but ambulatory and not typically in the hospital. They were mobile enough to go to an apheresis unit and then go to an outpatient physician, or outpatient clinic to get the injection. And it was a series of 3 injections, 1 a month. So all of that existed, but then it was one of a kind. Nothing happened for almost 10 years in terms of another FDA approval. And then suddenly it was a very different kind of product with CAR Ts, right? And CAR Ts were much more like stem cell transplant in many ways. The product is very different, but the indications was very similar. It was hematologists, oncologists treating these patients because it was unproven and costly. It was very last line. So you had to fail every other possible option, and then could be put on a CAR T. So these patients were in the hospital. The adverse events were, frequent and risky. They had to be managed very carefully, right? And so not only were the patients in the hospital, but they had to be in the hospital to follow up to keep them safe post infusion. And it was hemoncs who were very familiar with apheresis as starting material, and so what it ended up evolving, the clinical trials, of course, then were done at advanced medical centers because they were the ones used to treating these patients, and it was hematology oncology. And so you ended up, the clinical trials were done in advanced medical centers, which typically had FACT accreditation. They had a cell therapy lab because they were typically also the advanced medical centers that were involved in stem cell transplant. So it was easy for the stem cell lab to, the hemoncs were familiar with apheresis. The lab was familiar with, cell products coming in liquid nitrogen doer, and managing these cell products and thawing them. That was very routine for them, right? And so once these products got approved, obviously those clinical sites were the first tier of sites now delivering these approved therapies. The second tier was any advanced medical center that had a cell therapy lab and a stem cell transplant program and FACT accreditation. So all of the CAR T companies, flooded those centers, and we've tapped that out now. And what we've realized is that only about 20% of hemonc patients, at least the hemonc patients that CAR Ts are indicated for, are treated in advanced medical center. And the rest of the patients are treated in a more community setting.
That makes sense.
And in the community setting, oftentimes they may not be involved in stem cell transplant. They don't have a cell therapy lab. They don't have FACT accreditation. And so the healthcare infrastructure looks very different. And so we're right now just in the middle of this transition. We say we've just wrapped our head around what the model for delivering CAR T looks like in AMCs. And now we have to rewrite the model for community, because unless you're going to build fully integrated healthcare facilities in the community, in every community, which isn't plausible, then you need to figure out how to unlock outsourced providers that exist already in the community or are willing to be built in the community to support the healthcare infusion of these therapies in the community. And the reason why that's so important is, A, we have seen the sales of CAR Ts flatten to around 20%. So if we're going to get past 2 and 10, we either have to figure out, A, how to build advanced medical centers in the community, unplausible. Figure out how to finance every patient to travel for weeks at a time, to advanced medical center, also unplausible. Or figure out how to unlock an ecosystem of providers which can support the delivery of the safe delivery of these therapies in the community. And the second reason why this is so important is because, I just saw some very interesting data this week, actually, shared by Sharon, who's the VP of Scientific Affairs at ARM. It wasn't her data, but she was presenting it. I think it was presented at the ASCTC meeting, the tandem BMTs, we call it, the week before, which very clearly showed that for every 10 miles distance between the patient's home and the treatment center, your likelihood of receiving a CAR T dropped by 6.2%.
Wow.
So that's and 10 miles is nothing.
That's not far. Yeah, it's like 10 minutes.
But, the further out you get, the more reluctant these people are to go to downtown, to the cancer hospital, weave their way through the city and the myriad of parking lots and mayhem of, and go into this, cancer center to get treated. They'll opt for other treatments. Then to put a personal story on it, I talked last week with a mom who, to get her child treated from end to end, from the initial pre-eligibility visits all the way through to, the last follow-up, was 16 flights. And her and her husband both went, so it was 32 tickets for her husband, and her child. Right? Well, I guess
that's a heavy cost,
right? It was 32 tickets for her and her husband, and then also her kid, right? And, that's a cost, but that's also a ton of time off. You've got to be, you've got to have family support. You've got to have, the freedom from your job to be able to do that. Most people opt, I've seen some other data, 30 to 40% of patients, even when given an option of eligibility for CAR T, just because of that burden that we just described, opt to take an alternative treatment of care, even knowing that it might not be as good.
And like going back to that first trial you discussed, it sounds like these people were sick, of course, but now we're talking about with CAR T, like this is cancer. This is like from the patient's perspective, this is like asking people to travel it seems like a different sort of ask.
Even worse, for sure. But also the other thing that's happened from those initial trials to now is that at least 2, if not 3 of these CAR Ts have now been approved as second-line treatment. And I think one is on its way to first-line treatment. So these patients aren't even in the hospital, right? They're still at home, right? And being treated by their community physician. And so, as you see those patients, so that you could say, well, that makes them able to travel. But, yes, from a physical point of view, perchance, maybe. But still, all of the financial and familial and support reasons, that may be just completely impractical, right? And all the more reason to not require that of them. Let's treat them where they are, And so, and then imagine that we move past hem-onc into autoimmune disease, where all of the early exciting data is suggesting that we are moving toward, and you have much larger patient populations and patients who certainly are not in the hospital. They have chronic disease, but it's not acute, or it's rarely acute. And there is absolutely no reason for them to have to go to an advanced medical center for these kinds of treatment, right? Except be able to properly and safely manage the post-infusion adverse events, right? But that can be, even that, the REMS has been minimized now. Our ability to predict, adverse events, and when they come, the severity of them is diminished, and our ability to manage them has significantly increased. So as long as you've got, the ability to be able to refer and get these patients into the proper healthcare setting when they do present adverse events, everything else should be manageable in the community. But you can imagine, all the myriad of things that I talked about, have to be put in place for that to happen. So the hospitals are not familiar with the litany of administrative work that it takes to get these patients deemed eligible, right? It's the insurance companies have all kinds of different forms and, and questions, and, and there's a process, you have to engage to get these patients deemed eligible, even when a physician does want to prescribe it, right? And then there is, these places aren't factor credited. So then there's, is insurance going to pay if they're not factor credited? And so then there's been a conversation happening for the past year with FACT. Can you provide a different kind of factor accreditation that's more appropriate for smaller healthcare settings, community settings, than the advanced medical center, stem cell transplant kind of paradigm that you were initially built for, right? And so FACT has been working actively with the industry, and just recently, like in the past few weeks, this is all very new, right? It's come out and published FACT appropriate, our community appropriate FACT standards, right? And so now those are working, the applications are, the education's happening, and those who are aware are starting to apply, for those accreditations. And insurance is being educated, maybe we don't absolutely need factor accreditation to pay. It's a good to have, a solid to have, let's work toward that. But, let's not let patients die, while we're working on that. And then there's the infrastructural stuff, right? Like, okay, if your pharmacy doesn't know what to do with a liquid nitrogen dewar when it arrives on your dock, how are we going to handle that? And what if the patient's not ready and the frozen product has a limited shelf life and it needs to be thrown into a liquid nitrogen tank? You don't have a liquid nitrogen tank, and how are you going to manage, chain of custody and, all of these things? What other kinds of infrastructure is around that healthcare facility that can utilize that? And then from the apheresis point of perspective, some of these hospitals may not have an apheresis unit, or if they do, they're completely tapped out. They're operating at capacity. So, or they don't operate on the weekends, or, so how can we tap into existing outpatient apheresis capabilities like oftentimes exists in the blood center down the street?
Okay. And are those, like, in terms of the apheresis in particular, is that type of infrastructure commonplace in smaller, not major cities?
It is, this is where the blood center infrastructure really starts to shine, right? Because of course, in the Bostons and New Yorks and LAs and Seattles of the world, the advanced medical centers have this fully integrated infrastructure. They have everything in the hospital. There are also blood centers working in those environments, but the hospital also has everything internally to handle up to a certain capacity at least, right? In the secondary and third tier of cities, throughout the country, those hospitals don't have that internally, and the blood centers exist. So, just talking about the Blood Centers of America footprint, for instance, which handles about 54% of the blood component supply to the U.S. hospitals across the country. There are 400 bricks and mortar blood centers. Now that's just handling blood. But then if you look at just the apheresis, and much of that apheresis was built with Dendreon, right? That's why I raised that story. Much of that apheresis infrastructure was built in concert with Dendreon, which is still being collected and delivered today, and so within BCA, there's about 70 apheresis centers with 400 apheresis machines and beds that's fully staffed and nursed. That exists in the community, in the same blood centers that have this biological supply chain relationship already with the hospital for tens of years, right? And it's usually, there are trucks going back and forth between the blood center and the hospital every hour of every day, right? Delivering blood and blood components and recollecting expired products. And, but that apheresis and oftentimes the blood center has a relationship with the hospital where they will handle overcapacity, or they'll do weekend, or they'll sometimes run the entire apheresis unit entirely because the hospital doesn't want to run it. But they've needed an apheresis unit in the hospital. And so there's this hybrid of, blood center and hospital collaboration operating inpatient apheresis capacity and blood center outpatient apheresis capacity. And then a lot of our centers also will do what we call mobile apheresis, where a hospital might do, see 2 or 3 of these patients a month. Doesn't make sense for them sometimes to even have a machine. So we'll bring a machine and a nurse and offer, contract medical supervision and actually perform, the ad hoc apheresis either in that hospital or in the nearby blood center. And then, another level of mobile on top of that is, what you may have seen on LinkedIn, with BioBridge Global having actually put an apheresis unit on wheels and got that, and are working with FACT to have that accredited as a full-blown, fully accredited apheresis unit, and with FDA, having clearly said, as long as you check XYZ boxes, it's a legit apheresis unit, right? And then now we're really taking apheresis to the people, probably not pulling it up beside, mom and pop's house, but to the parking lot of the hospital in their local community.
Wow, that's a huge step, it seems, in terms of access. So we've touched on apheresis, the sort of administrative burden. I'm also curious in terms of like a machine, maybe other machine infrastructure. We talked about liquid nitrogen. What else is there sort of in these integrated, your New Yorks and LAs that might not be there in those smaller settings? Yeah,
well, the next obvious one is cryo, because most of the time, the apheresis is cryopreserved, so that you have the ease. You're not under super time constraints in terms of getting the apheresis product to the manufacturing site you've got the luxury of some time to organize manufacturing slots, etc. Even though you want to manufacture it as quick as possible because this is a patient's product. So, it's not like you're sitting it on the shelf, right? But the downside of cryo seems to be so nominal, right? These cells are viable enough that, in most people's opinion, the challenges of fresh logistics are outweighed by the benefits of cryopreservation logistics.
I'd love to understand that a bit better. Like in the sense, how is that? How is that?
So, we've been freezing cells for, 50 years at least, right? And we can keep these cells for a long time, right? I mean, I think the longest frozen stem cell transplant has been, almost 100 years, right? It's 60 years or so. I mean, we've used stem cell transplants in the 1960s. So whatever the math is on that, right? You can thaw these cells. I mean, they really just go, if you control rate freeze them appropriately with the right media, these cells are just really put in stasis. And when you thaw them appropriately, they just wake up like the day before they were frozen. Now, it's an overstatement, but the fact of the matter is there's a great deal of viability in these cells, and they seem to function how we need them to function. And, even there are still some hardcore advocates of fresh out there. But there are many more people, I'd say, who've done head to head and say they're viable enough that the challenges of fresh logistics are outweighed by the downsides of cryopreservation.
Okay, so operationally, it makes sense to, even if you lose some level of viability, it generally makes sense to ship it.
Because it frees up the supply chain, sort of timing and time sensitivity, right? Now, the other downside of cryo, obviously, is that now you're shipping, liquid nitrogen doers, right? I mean, this isn't just your picnic cooler, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, these are heavy, resource intensive things to ship around the country, right? And then I think there's some innovation happening in cryopreservation as well, which will be very interesting, because if this industry really scales into large scale indications, and we are centrally manufacturing, and that touches on our last conversation, but that's shipping a lot of liquid nitrogen tanks across the country every single day. And, depending how, concerned you are about the environment, that has a pretty big carbon footprint pretty quickly. Right.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious with the liquid nitrogen, it sounds like with the blood, the infrastructure is all sort of there. Does it require a lot of setup for other, does it require a lot of external setup for people to be able to, hospitals to be able to accept liquid nitrogen and actually use it like that?
Yeah. So, it used to be, we thought, cryo had to happen in a clean room, so you needed a clean room to do GMP cryo. We've moved past that now. There are closed systems for cryopreservation where it can be GMP proven and validated and operationalized outside of a clean room. And from BCA's perspective, just to use BCA again as an example, the theory is that we don't need cryo at every apheresis unit. But if we have cryopreservation capabilities in under 10 hours, so let's say ideally 5 to 8 hour drive from every apheresis bed, then we can cryopreserve the starting material same day or overnight, very quickly, quick enough to not have a deleterious effect on the material, and then ship it to wherever the manufacturing is being done. And so that's the infrastructure that BCA is committed to building out, and is not that far away from having. Right. Of course, in the Advanced Medical Center, it's it's across the hall or across the parking lot or down the stairs. Right. But
so I'm imagining that with the when we're talking about fresh versus frozen, we're talking about freezing within a probably pretty short time period. So that I'm imagining that distance we're talking about to the cryopreservation from the apheresis, that's got to make somewhat of an impact.
Typically, it does for sure. Typically, the window that most people use is sort of within 24 hours. They want it to be received and being frozen, right? Sooner the better, obviously. And ideally, we want to make sure it's not flight dependent, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you could have one cryo center serve the whole country if you are willing to fly star in or every eighth bag around. But that gets sort of logistically and financially kind of impractical, right? So ideally, we want to be able to have cryo. That's why I said, sort of single-digit hour drive from every eighth unit, and that way, and the infrastructure to set up cryopreservation now, GMP infrastructure, is not that expensive. It doesn't make sense a lot of times for a hospital to do it. But for a blood center where the core business is supply of all kinds of blood-based biologics, they oftentimes have it already, or it's a pretty easy lift to add control rate freezers and and some additional LN2 storage capability to their existing manufacturing footprint.
Okay, so we've touched on the blood transport, hospital administration. And previously, we briefly discussed the sort of manufacturing. So I'm curious. So it seems that's like sort of the next and last step in this whole process is getting the blood to and from the actual facility where this is happening. So what's the stance on that?
That's much more controversial, right?
Okay.
So whether decentralized manufacturing is an imperative part of affecting the kinds of market penetration we need for cell and gene therapy is very much up for debate. I think that's the last thing that we need to decentralize probably. And as much as I'm a huge fan of that vision and believe that will be part of the delivery of cell and gene therapies in the future, even I will admit we need to decentralize apheresis and cryopreservation and last mile pre-infusion support first and leave the manufacturing alone for now, right? And then, because also I think the prerequisite for decentralized manufacturing is still being proven out in these closed systems that we talked about on our last call, these manufacturing boxes, right?
Yep.
That still have yet to be proven and validated and, sort of heavily adopted and also completely digitized with a, sort of a common quality management system oversight that can be centralized and overseen, right? Those are all critical, I think, to wider spread adoption of decentralized manufacturing by at least for some products in some regions. So that I think will happen, but even I will admit that'll probably be the last thing or the longer term project. Whereas the other two, the needs around the first vein, the collection, and the needs around the last vein, the infusion, are absolutely pressing and critical to community adoption today.
Okay, so right now you can use the centralized manufacturing for access in the community settings, but the administration and the actual blood logistics, those are the immediate need to haves that's needed for a patient in a small town to get treated.
Yeah. And I think there's generally two approaches to making that happen, right? There's the hub and spoke advanced medical center model. I think the prime example of which is the Sarah Cannon Cancer Network model that was started, out of the Northeast. But MD Anderson and UPenn, and everybody has a hub and spoke model where they have smaller hospitals and outpatient clinics within their scope or their region or their contractual system that they want to start having be involved under their supervision and tutelage and mentoring and referral system, right? That'll be one approach to getting into the community. But it's interesting. I mean, just earlier this week, Joe DePinto from Inspirigene McKesson and I and Sanjay from Accenture were talking about the need for us as an industry to define the difference between community and community, and when we're talking about healthcare, because we don't really have a good way of talking about, sometimes an outpatient clinic is across the street from like UPenn, right?
Okay.
That's not exactly community healthcare
Yeah.
like I think of it. It's called outpatient.
We're talking about access to a small town.
It's not exactly like rural America.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But we don't seem to have a good way of talking about the differences between outpatient in an urban area and community healthcare in a rural setting, right? So, we're going to try and work on having a better nomenclature so that we can know what we're talking about when we're talking about these different levels, because there's still a lot of stratification even in the outpatient or community setting that happens, right? I mean, the first sort of paper I read a few months ago was on, community. They were talking about community healthcare, and it was Loma Linda University, right, which is the suburbs of it's in Glendale, California, which is a suburb of LA. Again, not exactly rural Midwestern America, but that's a first tier, and that's a good step, and that'll be an important part of the evolution toward what I think of as true community. And then there is just, blood centers, specialty pharma, and sponsors and hospital systems. And I think a new entry of player, which is the physician-owned clinical systems. So, you think of US Oncology or One Oncology, those are big examples of physician-owned clinical systems, right? I think sometimes they move faster and innovate faster and are more aggressive and entrepreneurial than administratively burdened, hospital systems, especially when they don't have large, deep pockets and large support systems. And I think it'll be very interesting to watch over the next 12 months where we see more traction, or if we see them simultaneous, or one just obviates the other. I think it'd be very interesting to see. My prediction is that we're going to see a lot more physician outpatient adoption of CAR Ts than many people think is going to happen. I think they think these are still too complex and too risky and too blah 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 for that really truly outpatient physician-owned clinics to manage. But I think they're also the more nimble and the more ready to just say, hey, we don't do everything. We'll do what we do well and outsource everything else. Right?
Yeah. It's the classic startup argument.
Yeah. So I think that'll be very interesting. And so I think the second model, I'm not sure I articulated very well, is just industry players leaning in on trying to empower, and unfortunately there's no cookie cutter model for community. It really is very community context driven. What do we have in that community, and how can we adapt the a la carte menu of options for this community?
So one thing, as I'm just putting together my mental model for the sort of frontiers and bottlenecks in terms of the community access. So there's the CDMOs. It sounds like for now those work well enough. And then there's the freezing of the blood, and that happens in certain places. So what's the distribution like in terms of access to the facilities that actually do this cryopreservation? Is it set up such that, we've talked about this hub and spoke, we've got the sort of centralized manufacturing, and then there are surrounding areas that have this freezing infrastructure? Is that sort of sufficient? Is that well set up, or is that still being sort of built out?
For the most part, there's way more capacity that exists today that is let me say it another way. There's a lot of capacity that already exists where it needs to exist that's being underutilized. Okay. People talk to me, for example, people often talk to me about the apheresis bottleneck, and it makes my head, I just blow a gasket. right?
Okay.
Because there isn't a shortage of capacity. So to the extent there's a bottleneck, it's a business problem, not an infrastructure problem.
Okay. So it's getting to, so it sounds
It's
like really on the
unlocking-
operational level, it's getting to there. Like it's getting
it's unlocking the commercial and financial contracts and money flow to be able to tap into the existing infrastructure, both on the apheresis and the cryopreservation, as well as sort of pre-infusion support that could be immediately put into place if people can get out of their own way on the business side. And they are getting out of their own way. We're all working together to facilitate this. And it seems like, oh my God, nothing's happening. But we've really only started to understand and then lean into this problem in the past 12 to 15 months, right? Where we've really understood, A, this is job number one, and B, figure out who needs to be leaning in on this and how can we all work together and how can we make it happen.
What are those current barriers in, if the operational stuff is there on the business side, what are the current sort of barriers there?
I talked about there's several, right? There are, if in the community it's going to require outsourced vendors as opposed to hospital, infrastructure that exists in the hospital, because right now the money flows from the insurer to the hospital, and then the hospital provides all the services, right?
Okay. Yep.
Even if we're providing apheresis sometimes in the hospital, we're doing it as a subcontractor to the hospital because the hospital gets the big check.
Right. They're like a general
contractor.
contractor.
The hospital's already factor credited. The hospital's a trusted provider, blah, 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 because that was the model for the advanced medical centers. But if in the community setting, it's going to require, some outsourced solutions, then how do we vet those outsourced solutions? And then how do we contract with them? And are they approved? And is there some sort of accreditation that we need to implement? And even regardless of the accreditation, the sponsors need to go and audit those vendors and make sure the vendors are going to be compliant with their BLA and the specifications. And so then you need to identify the vendors, contract with the vendors, audit the vendors, validate the vendors, and and make sure the contract and then sort of start that process alone takes months, right? That's where we are at today. So that pharma and the industry is trying to understand, we've crossed the hurdle now. We realize there's going to have to be outsourced vendors. So who should we use? Who are they, first of all? And who's there? Because it's different in each community. Sometimes in the community it's American Red Cross, sometimes the Blood Centers of America, sometimes they have cryo, sometimes they don't. So where's the closest cryo? So just the who's there is a big deal, first of all. And then if you think about doing that across every community, across the country, right? And then you have to marry that with a clinical team, which is, that's all well and good. You've got that in that community, but we haven't got a physician champion there. So you have to marry that with a clinical physician champion who wants to bring in the CAR T, right? And then you figure out, how do we contract? Do we want to contract directly with these vendors? Or do we want to continue to access these vendors as a subcontract through the hospital because that's the way the money is flowing today? Or do we want to disrupt the way the money flows, right? Is that something and is that a nice to have or is that a must have? Because also all of this is being transitioned from clinical teams to supply chain teams. And the supply chain teams are like, oh my God, I work in big pharma for 20 years. I've never seen anything as complicated as the supply chain logistics here. I need to learn this. I need to figure out what you're even talking about. What are these words? How I draw a map on the supply chain and there's just lines going every which way. So that's all happening, right? And then, once they're sort of all educated, blah, 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 then it's like, do we want to contract directly with these vendors or do we want them to be subcontract vendors of the hospital? But then from a supply chain side, now our supply chain is completely bottlenecked by hospital administrators. That seems like a nightmare, right? Like, why do we want our supply chain bottlenecked and managed by hospitals, right? That just doesn't make any sense. So can we contract directly with these vendors? And then, we've just been grappling for the past few months with legal and regulatory departments saying we can't pay directly to the vendors, to you as a vendor, because it's bundled in to the single case agreements that we negotiate as the reimbursement model for these things, right? So then it's educating them like, no, there's ways around that. You can opt out of that, and then and then the hospitals are resisting that because they think they're being paid for things that that now they're going to lose revenue on. So there's a whole ecosystem, there's a whole education, there's a whole contracting model that has to be understood, analyzed, and then all negotiated and put in place. And on top of that, natural inherent resistance. Insurers don't want to just start paying some random new vendor. They have no ideas, do they represent a safe vendor or not? And how can you make sure that they are safe? Is there accreditations? And so FACT has to evolve and keep up to all of that cadre of new vendors that are part of the ecosystem of the supply chain now, right? And is FACT necessary? Some people are saying, well, FACT can't keep up, then we got to figure out how to do it without FACT. And then, AABB has recently written, in conjunction with specialty pharma and pharmacy, some new pharmacy standards so that pharmacies at hospitals won't be so resistant to handling these kinds of products. Because some of these hospitals are like, we're not touching that product like that. We're not taking title of that. We don't know how to do that. You all figure it out, because we're not doing that. That's way outside of our wheelhouse, right? So, we've written some pharmacy standards to help pharmacists start to be comfortable with the handling of these products. And then, in addition to all the administrative, and financial issues, like, do we need different reimbursement models, right? I mean, we're talking about products that cost anywhere from $500,000 to $3 million. In a small community hospital, if they have to carry that cost for 90 days, that becomes an enormous cash flow problem now. Right, so there's all those issues to be working through, and this is not to talk about a litany of challenges that we're just bottlenecked by and can't figure out how to deal with. We are actively dealing with them, but it's more just a way of saying a lot of this stuff is happening. It's being worked through the system. We're tackling it, but it's complicated, and it's taking some time to get to systemically address.
So I'm curious, in terms of it sounds like it's a lot more of an administrative burden with the current model that's going through hospitals. Let's back to the sort of patient access. How might that affect a new patient if these subcontractors could be independently interacted with, as opposed to this flowing through the hospital? How might that impact a patient that is going for treatment, maybe in terms of timeline, for instance?
I think from a patient perspective, there's an education perspective. How safe is this therapy, and how educated is their physician on these therapies? Mm-hmm. The other thing that's happening with these things is the science and the risk profile and complexity is moving so quickly. If you formed your opinion about the risk profile or complexity or safety profile of a CAR T 18 months ago, you're woefully out of date, right? And in the community setting, oftentimes, these are parents with kids in soccer games and, a business to run. It's not exactly like they're going to ASH and ASCO, every 3 months, and, they're completely up to date on the latest of these things. So it's a big physician education thing. And then, the physician can make the patient comfortable with the risk profile and the advantages of these therapies. And then I think it comes down to some very practical things from the patient perspective. If I'm going back to what we said at the beginning of this conversation, if I have to travel 100 miles and I've got to, at one point, I'm going to have to be at the clinical site for 3 weeks, and I have to have family support there. I can't just boss it up there by myself, right? And in the meantime, I'm going to have to make at least a dozen trips, back and forth, before the infusion, lymphodepletion, and post-infusion follow-up, et cetera, et cetera. That's a luxury a lot of patients don't have, right? Even if the cost of the care is covered, by insurance, all of that other stuff oftentimes isn't. And there's just, people don't have the luxury of taking 6 weeks off and pay that much gas, to travel back and forth and days off work and, all of that, right? Even if you have a family person who's able to do that. So I think it comes down to some very practical things like that oftentimes. And so if we can figure out how to prevent a lot of that travel, if not all of it, and they can continue to be treated by the physician they're comfortable with, and the physician is educated, it will dramatically increase patient access. And that's great for patients. It's also great for the industry, because until we can prove that we're not going to plateau at 20% of the eligible market and start to get to 40, 50, 60% of the market, investors are going to freeze out, right? And they're going to look much tougher at this, because we're not just competing with other CAR-Ts, we're competing with BiTEs and other therapeutic modalities that might not be as good, but patients are choosing them because they understand that it's just way easier and something that they can imagine participating in, because the complexity for them, just life gets in the way of CAR-Ts right now.
Okay, let's sort of deconstruct like the 6 weeks a patient has to take out of their life. Yeah, that seems like a pretty difficult thing to ask of anyone. So, so if there's centralized manufacturing, there are facilities for getting the samples to the centralized manufacturing from the like the cryopreserved state. So then is the sort of, what is really currently keeping those patients in need of these 6 weeks away? Is it getting to a place which is close enough to get the blood drawn to then be brought to that cryopreserve?
Yeah, we're going to approach this stepwise, right? So, the first and easiest thing is to prevent them from having to travel that 100 miles for the apheresis. Absolutely no need for that, right? Like, we almost always, as an industry, have apheresis available to them much closer to home.
Right.
Very convenient, in a very nice suburban, almost boutique-like, blood center sort of environment, where they have, warm cookies and, Kool-Aid and TVs, right?
Yeah.
They're not winding their way through an oncology suite, in downtown, America, passing by people that are dying, So that's the easiest thing. And we have to be doing that first and foremost and immediately. Mm-hmm. Downstream of that, then, is the regional cryopreservation. That also exists. This is not a heavy lift, right? Getting apheresis closer to these patients, making that part of it easier, is a big start.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two is the debate right now. Almost all of these treatments so far require lymphodepletion, right?
Right.
So that's a chemotherapy drug, and an active debate now whether that needs to happen at the infusion site, or whether that can happen in a clinical setting much closer to the patient as well. I know very respected, highly respected practicing hematologists, oncologists who say lymphodepletion that does not have to happen in an advanced medical center. We need to have, again, in the odd event of an adverse reaction, we need to have a plan in place to get that patient to whatever. But there are drugs to handle these. We need to have them in hand. We need to educate the physicians to watch for what these reactions might be. But there's absolutely no reason why we can't lymphodeplete in the community close to the patient.
Okay.
Well, already the first two steps of travel have been largely eliminated if those things are true, right?
Right.
And so then we're talking about, where does the infusion happen, right? And which is the riskiest of the three steps, right?
Okay.
Because that's where we start to see ICANS and the adverse reactions. And so that's where we're talking about, okay, can we stand up in the infusion capabilities also in the community, right? So worst case scenarios, we eliminate the first two steps, but they have to travel for the last one. The big one. Eliminating 2 or 3 is great, but it's not. It doesn't get us where we need to get.
Yeah, that's
To get
still,
where we
they
need
would
to
still
get.
have to travel
We
to get
s-
to that last one.
We still need the infusion to happen in the community, right?
Yeah.
And whether that happens by hub and spoke, because the community setting is part of a bigger healthcare system that's connected with an advanced medical center somewhere up the food chain,
Mhm.
or we just have the kind of support, education, and referral networks so that if something goes bad with that patient in the community healthcare setting that's not capable of dealing with those adverse events themselves, and we think for the most part that's really just training and things. But let's say they're not comfortable, then how do we, as quickly as and safely as possible, get that patient either being referred to a physician who can come, or move to a hospital where they're more accustomed to dealing with those adverse events. Right?
Okay, that sort of, so it's like really the last mile there is the actual delivery of the drug.
It's the last mile, and then from there on, it's post infusion follow up, right?
Okay, let's get into that last mile. The current, so we've talked about some operational stuff. It sounds like a lot of the operational physical infrastructure, that stuff's there up until that point. What about for infusion? In small town rural America, is there specialized equipment, facilities that does not exist that is needed for that?
Not really. It's an IV pole, right?
Okay.
It's a IV pole and a needle. The sophistication is in physician training, education, and the healthcare, infrastructure needed to make sure that if this patient starts to go sideways on you, you know what to do, and you've got the medical expertise and experience and drugs available to treat those patients appropriately, right? But like I said, the incidence of adverse events is coming down. Right. The severity of adverse events is coming down, and our ability to manage them is going up. So
overall risk is decreasing.
The overall risk is, which is why the FDA this year at the lobby of ARM and others reduced the REMS, by at least half, right? This is the period of time which the patient was required to stay proximate to the infusion center, and was also restricted from driving and things like that, right? And okay. so that's been significantly reduced. So the patient already, even now, can go home much sooner, right? Because we now have a much more predictable window as to when we know these adverse events happen, and if they don't happen by such a time, we know they're very unlikely to happen, right? And we also have the ability to monitor these patients with, remote monitoring capabilities. The best way to predict whether someone is going to have an adverse event is the onset of a fever. And, a little fever is actually a good thing. That shows the body's responding. Is that we actually have seen data, right? That some level of adverse response is actually a sign that this is really working, and the body is reacting, right? But it's just predicting when we've crossed over from that's a good thing to now it's potentially a bad thing. But if we can even put with their Apple Watch or whatever system we want to strap onto them, sort of monitor their temperature. Right, we can know they're likely going to have an adverse event before they feel even symptomatic.
Wow, I'm curious about we've talked a bit about sort of education and doctor training being one of these sort of last frontiers. What level of is that? Like, you need a specialist to do that? Is that training that any sort of your family doctor can?
Not family doctor. I think it's the purview. It depends on the indication, right? Dendreon didn't present nearly the same risk profile because it wasn't a viral-based vector and engineered T cell, but so they were urologists, right? For the indications that we currently have approved for these CAR Ts, it's hematology oncologists. They're specialists, but a hematologist oncologist can handle these therapies, right, with the appropriate amount of education and sort of understanding of the things to watch for, and the right drugs in their cabinet, right? And this is why we're working. A lot of the industry is working increasingly with an organization called Community Oncology Associates, or COA, yeah, Community Oncology Association. So this is an association of oncologists who practice in the community. So they're not leading, they're not in the MD Andersons and Memorial Sloan Ketterings of the world. They're in community practices. And so COA they're very interested in how to support the physicians within their organizations practicing in that kind of environment, to help them understand, feel comfortable, feel like they've got the support and resources and referral networks, and do whatever it is we need to do with that type of physician to feel comfortable to treat patients with these therapies.
And okay, so once these physicians are sort of comfortable doing that, would that sort of close the loop in terms of the sick patient staying in their town for the most part?
Yeah, I think we've really if we're not treating patients, then it's not because we haven't brought the treatments to the patients.
Yeah.
Right. Keep in mind, we're also always competing against other easier, cheaper drugs, which may not be as effective, but if they're a tenth of the cost and easier for physicians to understand, for patients to understand, there's always alternative treatments, right? For people to refer, to prescribe, and to agree to have. And so you can't predict what the competitive profile of cancer treatments are going to look like, but we believe that that should unlock at least a doubling, if not tripling, of the addressable market here that we can, and the market penetration that we should be able to realize. And I just had a conversation earlier this week. I mean, as much as we bemoan the fact that we're having to go through all of this challenge and create all of this infrastructure now in a way which is probably quite predictable, but we just we didn't have the systemic motivation to solve these problems before they existed. Thankfully we are addressing them now, because if we were to have an approval in autoimmune disease, lupus, MS, type 1 diabetes, and there was to be an overwhelming patient demand for these therapies, we're not ready.
Okay.
I mean, hemonc has proven, with the small markets that we're failing to address now in hemonc, we're certainly not ready for big indications, right? So hopefully we can be ahead of that wave by putting into the infrastructure for these CAR-Ts for hemonc indications. It's the same infrastructure, it's CAR-Ts that are being used in autoimmune disease. All of the complexities of the supply chain and the education and the healthcare and the administration and the insurance and the accreditation is automatically transferable to a litany of other indications. It's going to be different referring physicians. So, now we have to educate endocrinologists and cardiologists and, other kinds of, ologists who are treating those patients. But the operational and systemic infrastructure and financial infrastructure that needs to be put in place will have been put in place, hopefully, by the time we get to those approvals.
So talking sort of as we're wrapping up here about the financial access. So we've talked about multi-million-dollar costs right now, and also talking about sort of the market of penetration. It seems like that would be an obvious thing that would hold back a vast majority of, if most people don't have $3 million sitting in cash available for treatment, are most people covered in the US for these kinds of treatments, or is it very hard to access that level of coverage for insurance?
It's certainly a very active conversation we're having with insurance, right? I mean, I can't speak to how many people in America have healthcare insurance for these kinds of products. What I can talk about is that, insurers are, I mean, Joe DePinto from Inspirigene just presented at a workshop I helped organize this week. They said in their conversations, and they're about to they come out with an annual report every year where they interview payers. Okay. And last year they interviewed, I think, 20 payers. This year they're hoping to interview 50 or 60 payers. And they said the thing that will probably really make the difference for them in terms of unlocking coverage. And he said that, for the most part, his experience, insurers aren't in the business of, and I think many people would beg to differ, but aren't in the business of trying to deny coverage. They don't want to support people dying. But, they're analysts, right? And what they're particularly interested in seeing is 5-year data, right? Because, of course, in America, you've got this situation where the average American changes healthcare plans like, once every 11 months or some crazy stat like that, right? And it's not even because you change it. Your employer changes it, you change jobs, you move states. And so when one insurer pays $500,000, $1 million, $1.5 million for a therapy, their patient isn't even in their system long enough for them to realize the ROI. The ROI gets passed on to another insurer and another insurer and a fourth insurer down the road. But systemically, if they can say, okay, overall, let's assume all that's a wash, right? Because I also benefit from somebody who moves to my plan, somebody else paid for, right? So if you assume all that's a wash, what they're really very interested in, the math that they're very interested in is the 3-year follow-on data is nice, but the 5-year data sort of really moves the needle in terms of what percentage of patients are still surviving and are now a much less burdensome cost than if I'm trying to keep patients alive because we're just continuing to, give them other treatments and things like that, right? If we've really cured them for at least a 5-year period, now they can really start to feel comfortable about the ROI for the price tag, right? Now, obviously, the ROI for something like cancer, where the patient, may just die, that's the cheapest thing possible for an insurance company, sadly, right? But that's a different math than if you have a chronic disease like type 1 diabetes, or lupus or MS or something like that, right? So the math is all different. Obviously, the price pressures are different, and this is where then now you start to see the other thing, which we can just hint at here in this call, but is the move toward drastically different cost of goods models, right? Where there is moves toward basically creating generic CAR-Ts already, even within the United States, certainly outside the United States, where there are nonprofit organizations, purporting to be able to deliver the same quality of engineered T-cell products for 1/10 of the cost. And this will put some very interesting, pressures on the cost dynamics, because of course there is a cost of production, but there's also a tremendous, imperative on the pharma companies to recoup their huge upfront investment on the science and the development of these products as well, right? So,
wow, I think that would be a great future episode. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, Lee. Thanks again for joining on the show.
Absolutely, always a pleasure, and you've got great questions and curiosity, and I enjoy the talk.
Awesome.